Hello, I'm Rob O'Malley.
And I'm Rachel Klein. We're joining you from the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion, or DoSER for short, a program of the American Association for the Advancement of Science.
Since 1995, DoSER has facilitated communication and engagement about science between scientific and religious communities, recognizing that these often overlap. This is part 2 of our 4-part series on science engagement with faith communities. In part 1, we discussed why scientists should engage with people of faith. Today, we'll discuss the social and historical context of public engagement with science, particularly as it relates to religion and faith.
As we saw in part 1, national surveys suggest the U.S. public is generally supportive of science and technology. On specific science topics, there are differences in opinion between scientists and the public, but that's not necessarily because the public doesn't understand science. Science doesn't exist in a vacuum. Political views, age, gender, race, and ethnicity, and cultural background, including faith, can all influence views on science topics, whether someone is a scientist or not.
Views about science are also informed by perceptions of scientists as people. Research suggests that scientists are viewed as competent, but not particularly warm or trustworthy. In popular media, scientists are often depicted as socially awkward, obsessed, and hostile, or at least indifferent, to people of faith.
In addition, science has sometimes been used in unethical ways. The United States Supreme Court case Buck v. Bell allowed the state to practice eugenics and forcibly sterilize people declared, quote, feeble-minded. The U.S. government's Tuskegee syphilis experiments directly and indirectly caused immense suffering and death among the Black victims and their families. This kind of history matters because it informs communities' perceptions of scientists in the present.
It's also critical to understand that it's not just history. For many communities, racism and prejudice in science and medicine has continued and is an ongoing lived experience.
For example, Indigenous communities continue to face hostility and dismissal of their concerns from scientists and other scholars. Black people are systematically undertreated for pain compared to white people. And in 2021, even as coronavirus vaccinations increased and overall infection rates were dropping, in Washington, D.C., for example, the racial disparities in who became infected got steadily worse.
Inclusive science engagement requires an acknowledgement and discussion of the relevant cultural and historical context.
We mentioned in part 1 that most U.S. adults identify as religious or spiritual. It's important to recognize that religion is a cultural practice that is lived. It isn't just about where or how someone worships. Similarly, although scripture and sacred writings are foundational to some faiths, reading them isn't enough to understand those religions. Scientists should understand that religion can influence many aspects of a person's life: diet, family, career, political and social views, and ideas about science.
Formal religion is also distinct from one's personal spirituality. People in the same religious group can have very different opinions on a given topic, even on subjects like evolution. We shouldn't assume that we know what someone thinks about a science topic just because they identify as religious.
For example, in one 2015 survey, 6 in 10 Americans agreed that science and religion often conflict. But in the same survey, only 3 in 10 religious Americans said that science sometimes or often conflicted with their own religious beliefs. This could mean that the idea that there is conflict is self-perpetuating. It encourages people to believe there is more conflict than they personally experience.
Finally, it's important to recognize that scientific and religious communities do overlap. As a group, American scientists tend to be more secular than the American public. However, in a 2016 survey, about 30% of biology and physics PhDs in the U.S., self-identified as religious. Many aspiring and early career scientists and students also identify as religious. One can be a person who values faith and science.
Today, we've talked about how science is embedded within a historical and social context. A number of factors influence views on science topics, which means that you can't predict someone's beliefs just because you know their faith. Most people worldwide value both faith and science. All of this is important when trying to create inclusive science spaces and constructive science discourse. In Part 3, we'll discuss best practices for science engagement with faith communities. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.